We'll challenge then, Richard, in your 5-minute presentation on where's that license. But Richard Burkitt from EBSCO, and again, thank you to our platinum sponsors to the conference, please. Richard.
Thank you. On my slide, there we go. So 5 minutes is a bit of a challenge. It's especially a challenge. I thought I had 20 until I was on stage, but that's okay because we can move at a bit of a pace. So my name's Richard Burkitt. I'm Director of Innovation at EBSCO. Thank you very much to the conference organisers and also to you guys for attending. It's wonderful to actually see you in person. So you probably don't know, or maybe you do, know what Folio is. It stands for Future of Libraries is Open. It is a response to increased consolidation within the library system marketplace. It is EBSCO and lots of libraries and vendors who have got an interest in the future of libraries. It comes in two flavours. One is a library services platform, which, as Chris mentioned in her wonderful keynote this morning, there's libraries that she would consider peers that are actually moving to Folio. Stanford is an example of such one. But of course, not everybody wants to move towards a new library system. Some maybe need to deal with what, for me, is the word of the conference, and that's digital. They need to be able to manage those digital workflows and make sure that you're moving from spreadsheets and other such high-tech devices like 3M Post-it notes over onto a system that manages your workflows. So thinking about what's been written in the past about electronic resource management, and it goes back for, 15 years or so, then we look to Graham Stone from JISC, we look to Jill Emery from Portland State University, and Peter McCracken of Cornell. And they have written something I refer back to an awful lot, and that's techniques in electronic resource management. And I often talk about this when people say to me, yeah, we've got an electronic resource management system. We get a MARC record and we put in the cost of that resource and the database that it relates to, and then we suppress it from discovery and we load it into the catalogue. Now, to me, that doesn't do all the things that maybe we would like. So I crudely came up, I hacked apart their wonderful work, and I came up with the life cycle, which will be familiar to you guys, I feel very sure. And then I put some questions against this, which may or may not resonate with you, but when I've sense-checked this against some library friends, they seem to say, well, actually, these are things that we'd like a system to work with us on, to answer these questions. And the questions keep on going. There's no end to the questions. But of course, with an open source piece of software like the Folio ERM, you're in the driving seat and you can define the direction in which it goes. So how do I manage all of this effectively? Well, the traditional way, of course, is spreadsheets and post-it notes. But of course, this is risk. And so if we can redefine how we manage these workflows and have a piece of technology which supports that ongoing relationship that you guys have with digital, then maybe we've got a chance of making the data work for us and collating it all into one place, which is where EBSCO comes in. And we offer this as a multi-tenant system, which is using the open source software, but it is defined by EBSCO in the use of our knowledge base, which if you have EBSCO Discovery Service, and knowledge bases are available from other vendors, and they're welcome to join as well, then we use those data and the suite of applications on our Amazon Web Services hosting service, and you use that system hosted, implemented, and deployed and maintained by EBSCO. Now that is a very whistle-stop tour, and I think I'm coming up to my time. I only have another 5 slides, but you know what? I can share this with you and I can talk at a lot more depth about your workflows, and I'd be delighted to do so. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Richard. And you're very wise not to come between people and their cocktail, I think. And well done on the timing. So now I'd like to introduce Stuart Hunt from the University of Reading, who's going to talk to us really about the Green Library, sustainability, the UN SDGs, and so on. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Helen. And thank you very much, everybody, for... Oh, didn't mean to do that.
You can have a bit longer than that.
Yep. So thank you very much. I was really pleased when the call for papers for this conference came out and they mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals, because I have never seen a library conference until the SILIP conference that's kind of going imminently in the UK that ever has mentioned it. And that's really quite an interesting observation that I kind of made. So that's really kind of the starting point where I'm coming from here. So I want to step back a little bit and think about the really rather well-known Greta Thunberg, who made an address to the European Parliament over 3 years ago, which I think kind of sets the scene for the problem that we're facing, where she said, around the year 2030, we'll be in a position where we will set off an irreversible chain reaction beyond human control that will most likely lead to the end of our civilization as we know it, which is quite humbling, quite threatening, quite concerning. And I think also that if you listen to anything that Greta Thunberg says, one of the things she said is don't listen to me, listen to the science. In other words, listen to the knowledge. And I think that's really quite appropriate for us as knowledge professionals as we think about navigating this space. So that's really kind of the context I want to really think about where we are. So thinking about sustainability, if you look at anything about sustainability, they tend to say there are 3 pillars of it, which are economic, which are environmental, and which are social. And then thinking about that into a library context, what might that mean for us in our library lives? Well, we might be thinking about sustainability in the terms of our estate, i.e. our library buildings, thinking about our collections and the literacy activities we perhaps do around those collections and with our student communities. And then also, I think really importantly, how we as a library act. What do we actually do? And then we heard earlier on the 4 pillars of the library service, which I would call content, services, facilities and staff, where taking the collection beyond what we might traditionally think of as a collection and thinking about content. So we can start to think about sustainability against those 4 particular angles into what a library does. Irrespective of thinking about sustainability, those 4 points stand, but we can think about sustainability in that context. So that gives us a kind of context on sustainability. So to moving on to thinking about the Green Library. And the first thing I'll say is the library is not a building with a green roof. It is not a building with a living wall. It is not a building with a bunch of pot plants in it. That is not a green library. A green library, I would argue, is all of the things that we are and that we do. So it's much more important than the building. I mean, sometimes it's very easy in library land to get building envy. Who hasn't had a new library or a refurbished library? I have a recent £40 million refurbished building, which I was lucky to take ownership of. But that doesn't really make it a green building. It doesn't make us a green library. There's a lot more to it. And there's a really good quote here. The first one, Saha Virta, who's a Finnish public librarian, who in an IFLA publication from 2018 defined the Green Library really nicely by saying the Green Library should be defined more extensively to include environmental awareness, dissemination of environmental information, the environmental friendliness of the library in its building and own activities, i.e. what we do, as well as its wider community support. And I think the community support bit is much more predominant in the public library sector we're seeing right now than in the academic library sector. But I can think about these pre-IFLA conference in Cork in July, which is bringing together, if you look at the programme for that conference, it's both academic and public libraries coming together. Really interesting programme. So I think we've got this notion now, the Green Library is more than the building. And I think there's a really neat example here, it's the second one I give you, which was from 2013, so a little bit old, that starts to think about, we shouldn't think about the library as a building because it can bring in an inferiority complex, if you like, and become very exclusionary in how we might feel. So the exclusivity of the term Green Library is an unfortunate side effect of the allure of a new and environmentally friendly building. It is harmful to those libraries that are serious about sustainability and are working to incorporate it into their mission despite the building we are housed in. So your building may not be great, but it doesn't mean to say you cannot be and cannot strive to be a green library. And there's a bit of work that's been done just recently, published last year by Fedorovitz-Krasevka, looking at a typology of green libraries and green librarianship. Now, this is built very much on an analysis of the scholarly output. So it's built on literary warrant, these kind of classifying the types of literature that are coming out around green librarianship. And you can see their strategies and plans, building and its administration, equipment and products, collections, programs, service. I won't read them all, you can read them yourself, but you can get the idea there. I would argue, and what I'm arguing today, is the first of those is most fundamentally the most important, because we can have a strategy for all of those other things that follow on from it. So when I think about library strategies, in terms of the climate crisis, in terms of sustainability, I think there is still a blind spot at best. There is certainly a failure in what library and library consortia strategies take into account. Now, some of that may be historically contingent. It reflects the time at which that strategy was developed. They may be a few years old and coming to the end of their life cycle, but some of them are new, and they're still not addressing the sustainability issue, the ecological crisis, particularly well. It's looking across the strategies I've looked at across North America, across Europe, we can see that there's very little acknowledgement of the ecological ceiling, any concern about the wider environment and how we interact within it. There seems to be a failure to acknowledge the interrelationship between social justice and climate justice, because if we look at what's going on in the world, which are the countries that are most disadvantaged in terms of social justice and disadvantaged by climate injustice, they are the global south. It is not us in the rich global north. So there's a very clear relation between social justice and climate justice. I think also we can find that sustainability and the climate crisis are absent from library strategies, or if they are there, they're merely a product or associated with something else. We might think about, oh, I'm doing digitization because it's sustainable. So we get it kind of using almost, I won't say it's an excuse, but it comes alongside, but is not treated as a value in and of itself. Or you might find in a library strategy that sustainability is a value rather than actually a strategic theme. So you might see under the typical vision, mission, values, it sits there as a value. So, and the other one really clearly is going back to those three definitions of sustainability is a really strong focus on sustainability in financial terms. And my own institution, my university, has sustainability as a university strategic theme, and it brings the financial and the ecological together under the same heading. And sometimes I have a problem with that. I keep that quiet, so I'm amongst friends, but it doesn't sit great sometimes to think about it. And also there's this issue that a library may well consider the Green Library as purely about the building. So I think those are some issues that I think we're really seeing. So I want to throw in the United Nations Sustainability Goals at this point. If those of you who are aware of these at all, aware there are 17 SDGs, and if you look at what each of them are, we can see how they may or may not be something that we directly can contribute to in terms of what we do. So SDG 4, for example, is about education, 5 around gender equality, reducing inequalities, SDG 10, there are some real clear issues identified in the SDGs that we as librarians can directly grapple with in our context, but we can also deal with in our position as a library within a wider institution and how we support, for example, research around decent working economic growth. So how are we contributing at that meta level, but how are we actually directly contributing to those things? And also I think the final one, the SDG 17, is about partnership for the goals. And we can see that partnership both in terms of what we do within our institutions, but what we do beyond our institutions. And I think that holistically taken together, these 17 SDGs really again show the clear interrelation between social justice and climate justice. So I want to take that one step further, and I don't know if any of you are aware of what's donut economics. There's developed by an economist called Kate Raworth, who worked in the third sector and is also a teacher at Oxford. Published a book in 2017 called Donut Economics, and there are 7 threads through that. And this illustration you're seeing here is the donut itself. It's a ring donut. It's not one with jam or with custard in the middle. It's a ring donut. And what you've got around the outside are the 9 aspects of the ecological ceiling beyond which we should not, as humanity, be exceeding. So you can see they're around climate change, they're about fresh water, they're about pollution. So they're very much ecological factors that constrain us. Within the inner ring of the donut, you can see there's a social foundation. And those 12 aspects in there are directly related to the SDGs. And if you read the literature, you'll see that when the UN were drafting the SDGs, they had an early version of the donut available to them because Kate Raworth had done a report for Oxfam, which defined the donut for the first time. So it's kind of been very influential in the UN's thinking, but it's now gone beyond that. So why am I going on about donuts? I think this is really key. The space we need to be operating is within that green zone. If we exceed the ecological ceiling, we're going further than we ought to be in terms of our environment. If we're under exceeding that social foundation, we are not lifting people up. We are not doing what we need to be doing as libraries. And I think that relates to us as academic libraries. And there's a movement within donut economics called the Donut Economics Action Lab, DEAL. These are where communities have been coming together, particularly at urban planning, for example, and looking about how can they apply the principles of the donut within a community. I have yet to see that thinking being translated into a university, and certainly not into a university library, but I would really love to see that happen. And if you're really interested in donut economics, just last week, Kate Roworth published a new afterword to her book, which reflected on the book 5 years hence. So moving on to think about us as research librarians sitting in a research library, I can't cover everything, but I want to pick up on two things. The first is around open research. You're probably hearing that some people have been talking about how open access can directly be related to the SDGs, how it can help. And yes, there is an argument that the free and unfettered access, OA in its widest evangelical sense, certainly gives us that. It gives access to information. But I think there are some caveats in there. I mean, Plan S has waivers for what the World Bank has defined as low-income countries and discounts for middle-income countries. If any of you read the Times Higher Education, you would have seen about 2 months ago there was an article by a Brazilian academic who said, my institution and my country are too wealthy, but I can't do open access. I don't have access to that finance. So actually OA is really kind of a thing that we in what we'll call the weird countries, which is Western, educated, industrialized, rich and democratic, can take most advantage of, whereas the Global South cannot do that. They do not have the infrastructure, they do not have the publishing, they do not have anything that will really enable them to take open scholarship forward in the way that we in the weird world can do that. And so I think that's really kind of important for us as we think about how we take our research forward. Is open research something that we kind of greenwash? Question. I'm not sure if that's being fair, but I think there's certainly an issue we need to pursue. And there's also, you may have seen that there's the Digital Humanities Climate Coalition based out of the University of Edinburgh very recently published a climate justice-oriented data management plans guide to how you might, in a DMP, take account of environmental issues. So it talks about life cycle of kit. If you're going to buy kit to do a particular project, it gives you advice on that kind of thing. So really key. The other area, when we think about ourselves as research libraries, we think about our collections. We always think about it's our unique and distinct collections that make us great. So one of the things we can start asking ourselves is, how do those collections that we've got actually support sustainability? Is there things that we have in there or things that we can use that actually demonstrate that? We heard about disinformation and misinformation. How are we accurately preventing the flow of the wrong things and getting information out to people around climate justice? How are we doing that? And I think also there's a really interesting relation, picking up the social justice, climate justice continuum. What about the relationship to decolonisation? If the communities and the countries most exploited by the climate crisis, the Global South, are also those who are post-colonial, are dealing with the aftermath of colonialism, how else should we think about the relationship of our work on decolonisation as work on sustainability and the climate crisis? No, I don't think we can simply say, oh, I've got a suggestions form that people tell me to buy these books which are about decolonisation and that solves the problem. It's bigger than that, but I think there's a question that I don't necessarily have the answer to that I think we need to pursue. So in terms of what we might want to do locally within our own institutions, when we start thinking about our own strategies, I think we really need to be thinking about net zero. We're hearing about that from our own institutions. We know it's really, really important. We need to be actively engaging with the SDGs, and I would argue with the donut as well as a theory, because if it's about financial resource, we all know what that's like. I think we need to think about a new operating model for ourselves as libraries. We need to think about the economics of how we work, which is not based upon GDP, but it's regenerative and it's distributive. So it's quite a different approach to how we think about economics. How we think about the information commons and how we are sharing, and things are open by design, so open is baked into what we do. Now we can think about that in terms of open research, when we put open resources out there, whether it's OA outputs, whether it's data sets that we're making available. How do we bake that in institutionally and within our communities, within our wider consortia? So, and we need to think about how do we actually experiment, how do we adapt, how do we evolve to take account of the climate crisis and the things we ought to be doing. And one really, really practical thing, if we take nothing away from this, I would say the words ethical procurement. Stop buying things from publishers or providers or suppliers who do not have a policy around EDI and do not have a policy around the climate crisis. It's a very easy thing to do. Why should we be funding people who are making a lot of money out of exploiting other people? We do it when we're having OA discussions, when we play quite hard-nosed, we play tough nut, when we negotiate with certain publishers. We should be considering these factors too. It's an ethical approach to what we want to do. We also need to be thinking about climate literacy and how we're doing that as it becomes a stronger agenda within our institutions. What does it mean for our collections? What does it mean for our preservation policies? What does it mean for our IT strategies? If you've got, like my institution, you've probably got a rolling program of replacement for your IT kit. After 3 years, you throw out all those PCs and they sit in a skip, and the university won't let you sell them or pass them on to anybody else because they're health and safety issues. I can remember working in a university, I won't name it, where the skip sat outside the library, and at the end of the day, there'll be students crawling around in that skip, pulling out bits of hardware. So, it's not a great approach. I think also our role can be in promoting our own institutional research around climate and the ecological crisis. My own institution is about to become the European Centre for Medium-Range Weather Forecasting. Kind of ironic that here I am in England, which is very anti-European, is having a European centre. The irony is not lost, but the money's coming. So, hey. And also we need to think about our library partnerships that aren't weird. We have a real tendency to band together with institutions who are like us. I think there's a lot more benefit about banding together with institutions who are not like us. We learn a lot more from people where there's difference involved. So let's not look at the global north, let's look at the global south and see how we can partner with those. And then clearly there's issues around our estate. And I would argue there's a dilemma between 24/7 access and the sustainability of your building. If you do one thing, have a conversation with whoever's in charge of sustainability in your campus. I put in the last 2 annual planning rounds, I put in a proposal that I would stop the building being 24-hour because of the sustainability and the well-being issue for students. I was told in my response from the Planning and Change Board was, don't even talk about it. But, that's kind of where we go. And I also say, if you've got an old building and you're thinking about a nice new building, don't build, refurbish, repurpose. You don't have to build something new. If you're a campus university, and they ask you, do you want a new library? You might say, yeah, great, but you might have to lose your location in order to get that new building because your prime real estate in the centre of campus might disappear. But that's the choice you might make. And the final thing, I think, is around alignment, institutionally and externally. What agendas are going on outside? Net zero, I've already mentioned, that's a key strategic agenda issue at my institution. There's definitely a growing awareness of climate literacy, so we're seeing initiatives like the Education for Sustainable Development, and we're certainly seeing sustainability coming onto the agenda of universities. It's now becoming kind of core content across programs that there is a sustainability element. There's a scheme called the Climate Ambassadors, which was launched about a month ago, which is my university and a private provider in the UK have nationally launched a scheme of climate ambassadors where academics and university staff, including librarians, will go out into local schools and talk about sustainability. And then in England, we have a natural history general certificate of education. This comes for year 11 pupils in the UK, so 16-year-olds when they take their exam. There's a new natural history qualification coming in 2025. Alignment with our own research agendas is really key. And also externally, there's 2 things that I think are really relevant to this. The Times Higher Education impact rankings are directly about the SDGs. Not every university is automatically included in those impact rankings. You choose to be so. In the latest set of results, which came out a couple of weeks ago, there are 10 Republic of Ireland institutions in that table. So it's well worth looking at. And they give a league table for who comes top against each one of those separate SDGs. And there's also something called the People and Planet University League, which exists in the UK, which effectively gives degree-level classifications to universities based upon their sustainability. So you can have a first, you can have a 2-1, you can have a second or a third. So I will leave it there, and I'm leaving it with, these are the climate stripes produced by a climate scientist at my own university. You may have seen these at COP26. Thank you very much.
Stuart, that was excellent. I can think of 1,000 questions already.